A billionaire CEO walks into a nightclub to escape her loneliness, but danger finds her first. A single dad security guard steps in, changing both their lives forever.
Alina Jasper's penthouse overlooked the entire coastline of Barcelona, a place most people would have called a dream, but to her it felt like a beautifully decorated cage suspended above the world. She stood barefoot on the cold marble floor, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the evening lights of the city flickered awake beneath her. The sea breeze brushed past the glass, and even through the silence she could almost hear the city living without her. Laughter, music, conversations, all those simple things she rarely tasted anymore. She was only 33 years old, yet her life felt older, worn out by the weight of expectations she had carried since her early 20s. Being a billionaire CEO looked glamorous from the outside, but no one ever saw the trade-offs: the constant pressure, the endless meetings, the lack of anyone to come home to. She had built her tech empire from a small co-working table to a global powerhouse, but success came wrapped in a loneliness she couldn't escape. No matter how many awards hung on her walls or how many people praised her business genius, the penthouse remained quiet every night, a silence that stretched through the living room, bedroom, even the kitchen where she barely cooked. She thought often about how strange it was that she could negotiate billion-dollar deals with world leaders, yet couldn't figure out how to let another person stay in her life. Her breakup from 2 years ago had hardened her more than she liked to admit. Her ex had claimed she was too focused on work, too unavailable emotionally, too distant, and Alina hated how much of it was true. So somewhere along the way, she had stopped trying. Now she filled her free time with things that distracted her rather than comforted her. That night, she leaned against the kitchen counter and let out a long breath, feeling the weight of another exhausting week. She knew if she stayed in, she would drown in her thoughts. She needed noise, movement, something that didn't require her to think or perform. On weekends, there was only one place where she could be invisible: the nightclub, tucked in a busy street near La Rambla, a place where strobe lights, loud music, and crowds blended everyone into the same blur. No one looked at her as a CEO there. They looked at her as just another woman dressed up for a night out. Alina went to her bedroom, chose a simple black silk dress that hugged her figure without drawing attention, and slipped into a pair of heels that made her feel slightly taller, slightly braver, slightly less hollow. She applied minimal makeup, enough to hide the tired lines beneath her eyes, but not enough for anyone to mistake her for the social type. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the girl staring back. She looked polished, elegant, and calm, but inside she felt tired. Tired of pretending she didn't need anyone, tired of carrying everything alone, tired of being admired, but never understood. She grabbed her clutch, walked through the silent hallway, and locked the door behind her. The elevator ride down felt endless, as if the building itself knew she was leaving to escape the life she had created. Outside, Barcelona's night air felt warm and alive. Cars honked, people chatted in Spanish and Catalan, street performers played their instruments, and tourists wandered around with excited smiles. It made her feel even more like a ghost in someone else's world. She called a car, and by the time it arrived, she had already convinced herself that she didn't need companionship or romance. She just needed a few hours where she wasn't Alina Jasper, the woman everyone expected to lead, decide, and control. When she stepped into the nightclub, the bass vibrated through her chest, and the lights painted shifting colors across her skin. She ordered 2 shots quickly, letting the burn warm the cold corners inside her. She didn't want to think about her company, her empty penthouse, or her ex's last harsh words. She wanted noise, movement, and temporary freedom. She stepped onto the dance floor, letting the crowd swallow her, letting the music drown her thoughts. For the first time in days, she relaxed her shoulders, closed her eyes, and let the beat take over. She didn't know it yet, but that night would not end the way she expected. She wasn't just escaping loneliness. She was walking straight into the moment that would change her life forever.
The music in the nightclub grew louder as the night deepened, and Alina let herself sink into it, grateful for the rhythmic pulse that numbed her thoughts. She felt light, almost weightless, as if the stresses of her week were dissolving in the haze of neon lights and alcohol. With every beat, she loosened up a little more, letting the spinning colors and the laughter of strangers wrap around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she needed. People danced around her, lost in their own worlds, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the center of anything. She was just another person in the crowd, and that anonymity soothed her. She lifted her arms, swayed to the music, and let her mind drift far from boardrooms, deadlines, and the endless expectations that usually weighed on her shoulders. But while she was trying to forget herself, others were starting to notice her. A group of 3 men at the bar had been watching her for several minutes, leaning in, whispering among themselves. She stood out, not in a glamorous way, but in a vulnerable, unsteady, too alone way. Her movements were slower now, her balance softer, her smile unfocused as the alcohol seeped deeper into her system. One of the men raised his brows at the others, silently suggesting they approach her. They grinned, finished their drinks, and made their way toward the dance floor. Alina didn't notice them right away. At first, they blended into the crowd like everyone else, and when one of them started dancing beside her, she didn't think much of it. People dance close in places like this. It wasn't unusual. She even laughed when one of them spun her lightly, her dizziness making the motion feel more playful than it actually was. But as another man stepped in closer, and then the third circled behind her, the space around her shrank. She tried to take a step back, but one of them moved to block her without making it obvious. They were smiling, acting friendly, pretending to be harmless. She couldn't fully process their intentions, not with her head foggy and her body slow to respond. When she stumbled slightly, one of the men caught her arm with fake chivalry, but his grip lingered too long, too tight. She tried to pull away with a small, "I'm okay," but her voice wasn't steady, and they exchanged knowing glances. The DJ shifted to a slower, heavier beat, and the men used it as an excuse to move even closer. One leaned in and whispered something near her ear, and although she didn't understand all the words, the tone made her stomach tighten uncomfortably. Another placed his hand on her waist, guiding her toward the side of the dance floor. Alina protested weakly, but the alcohol muted her instincts, and the crowded room made it hard for anyone else to notice. She tried to look around for help, but the flashing lights made it difficult to focus on anything. The men were already steering her to a corner sofa tucked in a darker area of the club. Her legs felt heavy, her thoughts slow. She sank onto the sofa more from imbalance than intention, and before she could stand again, they sat around her, one on her left, one on her right, and the third in front of her, blocking her from sight. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. The friendly smiles they'd worn on the dance floor were gone, replaced with looks that made her heart beat unevenly. One man rested his hand too high on her thigh. Another brushed her hair from her shoulder, fingers lingering with a possessiveness that terrified her. She whispered, "Stop," but it came out weak, slurred, barely audible over the music. She tried to push one of them away, but her hand felt like it was moving through syrup. Their bodies crowded closer, forming a wall around her. The smell of their cologne mixed with sweat and alcohol made her feel sick. Her pulse quickened, not from the music now, but from panic. She didn't want to be here. She needed someone to notice, someone to intervene, someone to pull her out of this trap she had stumbled into. But when she looked up, her vision blurry and her breathing growing shallow, she didn't see an exit. She saw only the 3 men closing in on her, their eyes sharp with intent, and for the first time that night, Alina realized she wasn't just lonely anymore, she was in danger.
Alina's head dropped back against the sofa as her vision blurred, the room spinning more violently now that she was no longer moving with the music. The men had closed in on her completely, their bodies forming a tight circle that kept her hidden from the rest of the nightclub. Her breathing grew shaky as her awareness sharpened just enough to understand that something wasn't right anymore. When it started as harmless dancing, it shifted into something dark, something she wasn't prepared for. One of the men placed his hand firmly on her knee, sliding it upward without hesitation, while the one sitting closest to her whispered something she couldn't fully register because his breath was hot against her ear and her mind felt foggy, disoriented. She frowned, trying to lift her hand to push him away, but her arm felt heavy, almost detached from her body. The music thumped around her, but it suddenly felt distant, muffled by the fear rising like a slow tide in her chest. She tried to speak, tried to form the word, "no," but only a thin breath escaped her lips.
Her instincts were screaming that she needed to get out, but her drunken body refused to cooperate. The third man, positioned in front of her, leaned forward and placed his hand on the back of the sofa, trapping her in. His eyes gleamed with a confidence that made her heart drop. They knew she couldn't fight them. They could see it in the way her head wobbled, in the weakness in her limbs, in the confusion clouding her expression. One man brushed his thumb over her cheek, pretending to wipe something away but letting his fingers drag down her jaw in a way that made her stomach twist. Another let his hand slide across her waist, pulling her a fraction closer. She tried to suck in a breath and gather enough strength to shout or stand or do anything, but her body wasn't listening. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the music. Her vision distorted every time the club lights flashed, making the men's faces stretch and blur like a bad nightmare. She could smell their cologne mixed with alcohol and sweat, and for a split second she felt trapped in a memory she had worked hard to bury, a moment from years ago when she had been vulnerable and someone else had tried to take advantage of her. She had built a fortress around herself ever since, a fortress made of work, success, and emotional distance, but tonight she had walked right into danger without realizing it. The man in front of her leaned in even closer. "Relax," he murmured, pretending to sound soothing although she could hear the hunger behind his voice. She shook her head weakly, her lips barely moving. She tried to shift away from his touch, but the other man tightened his grip on her thigh, holding her in place. Panic spread through her nerves, burning through the haze of alcohol. She reached out blindly, searching for something to grab, someone to notice her, but her hand only brushed the edge of the sofa. Her body trembled with a mixture of fear and helplessness. The men exchanged quick looks, as if deciding their next move. One of them slid closer until his leg pressed against hers. Another leaned over her, blocking the view of anyone who might have glanced in their direction. It was a practiced formation, one they had probably used before. 3 men cornering a drunk woman in the shadows of a loud nightclub. Alina felt herself slipping into panic, every instinct inside her screaming that she needed to escape or something terrible would happen. She opened her mouth again, forcing out a faint sound, a whisper of a protest that the music swallowed whole. Her eyes darted around, desperate for help, but the lights blinded her and the crowd blurred into meaningless shapes. She felt like she was sinking, like her body was giving up, like the world was disappearing into a tunnel, and just when one of the men reached for her again, pressing in closer, she felt something shift in the air. A presence, a shadow, a silent interruption that cut through the chaos. Someone had seen her. Someone was coming. She didn't know who it was yet, but in that moment, weak, scared, and barely conscious, Alina felt the first flicker of hope break through the fear tightening around her chest. Robert had been watching the scene unfold long before Alina realized she was in danger. As the weekend security supervisor, he always stood in places where others rarely looked, shadows near railings, corners where he could observe everything without being noticed. It was a habit he'd picked up not just from his years in private security work, but from being a single dad who had learned to read people quickly. Life had taught him to stay alert. His 8-year-old daughter, Maya, depended on him entirely, and he couldn't afford to take risks at home or at work. That night, as he scanned the club, his eyes kept drifting back to the woman in the black silk dress who had arrived alone. She wasn't loud or wild like the others on the dance floor. There was a heaviness in her posture, a quiet sadness that clung to her even as she tried to dance it away. He didn't know she was a billionaire CEO. He didn't know her name at all. He just saw a woman trying to escape something, and he kept an eye on her the same way he would keep an eye on any woman alone in a club filled with unpredictable people. The moment the 3 men approached her, something in his gut tightened. He'd seen their type before. Men who acted charming while circling like predators, waiting for the right moment. He didn't step in at first because nothing had crossed the line yet, and grabbing a guest without cause was the fastest way to lose his job. But as the drinks hit her harder and her balance faltered, he watched the men exchange looks that made his blood heat with anger. When they guided her to the sofa, he stopped leaning against the railing. When they sat around her, blocking her from sight, he started moving. And when she lifted her hand weakly, as if trying to push one of them away, Robert's patience snapped clean in half. He approached slowly at first, not wanting to escalate the situation without understanding how bad it had gotten. But the moment he reached the edge of the sofa area and saw the man's hand sliding further up her thigh, saw her head wobbling with fear and her lips forming a soft, helpless protest, something primal took over his calm. His voice cut through the pounding music, low, steady, and firm enough to make all three men turn. "That's enough," he said. The men exchanged annoyed glances, the kind of casual arrogance that convinced Robert they'd done this before. One scoffed, leaning back as if Robert was just an inconvenience. "We're just talking," he said, his tone dripping with mock innocence. Robert didn't bother explaining himself. His eyes didn't leave Alina, and when he saw her trembling, that was all the confirmation he needed. "Stand up," he told the men, his jaw tight. "Now." The one on her right pushed up from the sofa and got in Robert's face, the alcohol twisting his confidence into foolishness. "Walk away, man. She's fine." Robert didn't move. The man shoved him, expecting him to stumble back. Instead, he stayed rooted to the spot, his face unreadable. The next moment happened fast. The drunk man swung his arm, sloppy and wide, but Robert blocked the punch with ease and pushed the attacker back hard enough to make him crash into his friend. Another lunged forward, but Robert grabbed him by the collar and shoved him into the table, splashing drinks everywhere. The third man hesitated, suddenly realizing they weren't dealing with an ordinary bouncer. A small crowd started to form around them, but the men backed off, muttering curses as they stumbled away, choosing escape over humiliation. When the danger faded, Robert turned to Alina. She looked small, fragile, and lost in the swirl of lights. He crouched down, speaking gently now, as if switching into a different version of himself. "You're safe," he said, placing his jacket around her shoulders. Her eyes tried to focus on his face, her breath shaky as she spurred something he couldn't quite understand. He didn't rush her. He helped her sit up straighter, gave her a glass of water, and kept his voice calm and steady, everything she needed in a moment when her world felt unstable. He stayed with her until she could stand with his support, refusing to leave her side even when other staff came to check on the situation. In a club of strangers, he became the one solid thing she could hold on to. And even though she didn't know his name yet, Alina would remember the warmth of his voice and the steadiness of his presence long after the music stopped. She didn't realize it then, but this man, the quiet, watchful single dad, was about to change her life in a way she couldn't have imagined. The car door closed with a soft thud, and the driver pulled away from the curb while Robert stood on the sidewalk watching until the taillights disappeared into the Barcelona night. Only when he was sure she was completely safe did he finally exhale. His heart was still beating harder than usual, a mix of adrenaline, anger, and the lingering worry that came from imagining what could have happened if he had been even a minute late. He headed back inside the nightclub, his jacket still draped over her shoulders inside the car, and tried to settle his thoughts. He had helped dozens of drunk or endangered guests before, pulling them away from fights, escorting them out when they were too far gone, making sure no one took advantage of anyone else. But this woman felt different. There had been something in her eyes, even through her drunken haze, that unsettled him. A quiet pain, a kind of loneliness he recognized instantly because he had worn that expression himself more times than he'd like to admit. After the incident, he filed a report with the manager, gave precise details, and finished his shift with a silent heaviness sitting in his chest. By the time he walked home in the early morning light, Barcelona was waking up around him, and he knew Maya would already be stretching in bed waiting for breakfast. He pushed the night out of his mind the second he opened a door, and she ran to him with messy hair and sleepy eyes. With his daughter, he never spoke about the dangerous parts of his job. She only knew her father worked hard to take care of her and that he was the safest person in her world. Meanwhile, Alina sat in the back of the car gripping the jacket around her like a lifeline. Her head still throbbed and her thoughts blurred in and out, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the men closing in, the shadows, the panic that gripped her chest. And then she saw him, the man with steady eyes, who knelt beside her like she was something worth protecting. When she reached her apartment, the driver helped her inside, but she refused assistance once she was through the door. She stood in the middle of her silent penthouse, her legs unsteady, her heart bruised by fear and gratitude at once. She walked slowly to her couch, sat down, and buried her face in her hands. For a woman who was used to being in control of everything, losing that control, so publicly, so abruptly, shook her deeply.
She hated that she had been vulnerable. She hated that she had been alone. But she also knew she had been incredibly lucky that someone had noticed. Someone who didn't know her name or fame. Someone who stepped in because it was the right thing to do. When she finally drifted into sleep, still wrapped in this jacket, she felt strangely comforted by the scent of someone who felt grounded and real in a world where almost everything around her felt cold. By late morning, she woke with a heavy headache, but a sharp memory of everything that had happened. As she sat drinking water in her kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message from the nightclub manager apologizing profusely for the night before. Attached was the incident file, including the name of the man who had saved her. Robert Hale, security supervisor. She stared at the name longer than she expected to, tracing each letter as if it already meant something. She didn't usually get personally involved with anyone outside her tightly controlled circle, but this didn't feel like involvement. It felt like responsibility, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. She placed her glass down firmly and made a decision before fear or pride could interfere. Within an hour, she was dressed and on her way back to the nightclub, not as a customer escaping loneliness, but as a woman determined to thank the stranger who had stepped between her and something she never wanted to imagine. As she walked through the doors, the staff stared in shock. CEOs of her reputation didn't walk into clubs in broad daylight. But she didn't care. She wanted to find Robert. She wanted to look him in the eyes while sober and say the words she couldn't form last night. She wanted him to know that he hadn't just saved her from a bad moment, he had reminded her that there were still good people in the world, people who stepped in without expecting anything. And even though she didn't know it yet, the decision she made that morning was going to change both of their lives forever.
Robert didn't expect to see her again. After his shift, he spent the morning cooking pancakes for Maya, helping her with a school project, and pretending the previous night had already faded into memory. He didn't save people for recognition. He did it because he couldn't live with himself if he walked past someone in danger. So when the nightclub manager called him around noon and said, "Robert, you need to come to the office right away," he thought maybe there was a problem with the report or a complaint from the guests involved. He wiped his hands on a towel, told Maya he'd be back soon, and hurried out. But when he stepped into the club's main hallway and saw Alina Jasper, fully sober, composed, elegant even in a simple blazer, standing near the manager's desk, his entire body went still. She wasn't the frightened, slurring woman from last night. She looked like someone used to commanding boardrooms and changing industries. And for a moment, Robert felt strangely out of place. He lowered his gaze slightly, unsure if she even remembered him. But the second her eyes met his, he knew she did. Her expression softened in a way that told him she had been waiting for him to walk in. "Robert Hale?" she asked gently. He nodded, and the manager quickly excused himself, leaving them alone in the quiet hallway. There was a long pause before she finally spoke again, this time with a voice that held both gratitude and something deeper. "I wanted to thank you, properly, for last night." Robert shook his head as if the gratitude made him uncomfortable. "You don't have to thank me. I was just doing my job." She stepped closer, her eyes steady. "You didn't just do your job. You stepped in when no one else saw what was happening. You kept me safe when I couldn't protect myself." Her voice trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with sincerity. "That's not something I forget." Robert didn't know what to say. Compliments, especially emotional ones, always made him stiffen up. Maybe it was years of working in tough environments. Maybe it was being a single dad with too many responsibilities and too little time for praise. "I'm glad you're okay," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. She nodded, then reached into her bag, pulled out his jacket, and handed it to him. "I washed it. I slept with it last night. It made me feel safe." His honesty made him blink twice, caught off guard by the vulnerability of her words. Before embarrassment could creep in, she took a breath and straightened her shoulders the way CEOs do when shifting back into business mode. "Robert," she began, "I want to offer you something." His brows rose, unsure of where this was going. "I run a global tech corporation. Security is one of the most important parts of my life, both professionally and personally, and I don't trust easily." She looked him straight in the eyes, her voice firm. "But I trust you." Robert felt the weight of those words. Trust wasn't something most people gave him up front. People trusted his strength, his discipline, his work ethic. But trust him as a person? That was rare. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. Alina took a small step closer, her expression steady but hopeful. "I want to offer you a permanent job, full-time, better pay, better hours, stability for you, and safety for me." She paused, letting her words settle between them. "I want you to be my personal security in charge." For a few seconds, the world around Robert seemed to go quiet. Being a single dad meant worrying about rent every month, juggling 2 jobs, missing sleep, and hoping life didn't collapse under the weight of bills and responsibility. A stable, well-paid job didn't just help him, it changed everything for Maya too. But he wasn't the type to accept something just because it sounded good. "Why me?" he asked honestly. "You don't even know me." Alina smiled, not a corporate smile, but something warmer. "I know you did the right thing when no one was watching. I know you didn't want anything in return, and I know I've never felt safer with anyone else." His breath caught slightly at the sincerity in her voice. For years he had carried the weight of protecting everyone around him without expecting anything back. Hearing someone value him for that, really value him, felt strangely overwhelming. He swallowed, thinking of Maya's future, thinking of the nights he came home exhausted, thinking of the stability he longed to give her. And after a long moment, he finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll take the job." Alina's expression softened with visible relief. In that quiet hallway, something shifted between them, an unspoken beginning neither of them fully understood yet. He had saved her life without knowing her name. She had changed his life without expecting anything in return. 2 lonely people, brought together by a night neither of them would forget, walked out of that nightclub no longer strangers, but 2 lives unexpectedly intertwined.
If you enjoyed this story and want more emotional twists, single dad heroes, and powerful character journeys, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Drew Daily Stories. Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable tales.